Hey, it's Sela Social Studies.
Hey guys, welcome back to Sela Social Studies. Now we're going to be covering the third installment of the Great War, World War I, and this is going to be changes in warfare in World War I. If you remember when we covered the Civil War in the United States up until 1865, 1861, 1865, you have to remember that these guys are fighting with muskets. You have to load and reload these muskets with a type of lead ball and black powder, and it takes some time to get that stuff done. So casualties were high, yes, because of the archaic ancient Roman battlefield styles of lining up in rows and shooting each other. But in World War I, this all changes. After Congress voted to declare war on Germany on April 6, 1917, the American forces began to mobilize for an unprecedented attack in Europe. Finally, on June 26, 1917, the first 14,000 American troops arrived in France. When all the Americans arrived, the Allied forces were on the verge of losing the war, and both fronts were suffering a great amount of casualties. When the American soldiers arrived, they were given the nickname Doughboys, an unflattering but well-deserved name. Upon their arrival, most European soldiers were fighting and living in the trenches for over 3 years and eating small rations to keep them alive. While American soldiers were not chubby, to the many starving European veterans they were. Their look was also not ignored by French women. Many American soldiers fell prey to the Paris nightlife, and the American men contracted diseases from French women, costing the American government millions in medicine and anti-French propaganda. The first U.S. troops to arrive were called the American Expeditionary Force, led by General John J. Pershing. These troops were well trained before they were to reach the front lines. The force was a mixed group of Army and National Guard troops, draftees, and inexperienced volunteers. When they arrived in Europe, they were not thrust onto the battlefields with the European soldiers, but they joined as a separate force from other Allied units. Pershing wanted to have complete control over his unit. As African American soldiers joined the wartime effort, they had mixed reactions to engagement, most notably that the French soldiers treated them better than their American counterparts. Even Germany fed on American racism in the effort when German propaganda was dropped from the sky or over black units, promising a less racist world if the Germans won the war. The war was not only fought on land, however. As we've discussed, there were many battles happening on or even under the sea. Much of the fighting took place in the Atlantic Ocean and in the North Sea. We've discussed how the British would blockade German trade ports, breaking the German supply lines, and Germany responded by using unrestricted submarine warfare, torpedoing American, French, and British supply ships. They were improved naval weapons on each side of the war. The most dangerous British warship of the time was called the Dreadnought. Many naval ships were small and carried only small caliber weapons. The new British Dreadnought were large, metal-clad ships that carried powerful, long-range, heavy caliber guns, which allowed them to hit enemy ships and enemy land targets from a safe distance. World War I also saw the introduction of the improved German U-boat. As I previously discussed, German U-boats or Unterseeboots launched torpedoes from underwater and escaped undetected, sinking many Allied ships and passenger ships. German unrestricted submarine warfare was a leading factor in the United States' aggression against Germany. World War I saw a different type of warfare than Americans were used to fighting. Just remember, like I said, 60 years earlier, Americans stood shoulder to shoulder shooting each other at point-blank range during the Civil War, and then the Spanish-American War was over before it even started. What Americans witnessed in Europe was a new, surprising type of warfare: trench warfare. Allied and Central Powers would dig a long series of trenches where soldiers would defend a position from the protection of deep ditches. The trenches were deep, cold, wet, muddy, and disgusting. When it rained, the trenches would gradually fill with water. Even though soldiers placed duckboards on the floor of the trench, it did not stop the infestation of wet boots and trench foot. Trench foot was a health issue where the feet of the soldiers would stay wet and flesh would literally rot off of the foot. Trenches were filled with corpses, large rats, and feces. When trenches would flood, so would the bathrooms. Sickness and diseases ran rampant in the trenches. So how does trench warfare work, right? Here is what a trench would look like. Now, this looks like a trench that has been on the front line for a while. Sometimes they are better. You don't really see that duckboard. It's probably been bombarded. This one probably hasn't been made quite well. It might be a connector trench between the two main trenches. But you see here these guys with their machine guns walking through. The Allied army would send thousands of shots or gunfire to the Central Powers' trenches, sometimes lasting hours. And when the Allied powers felt that they had inflicted enough damage, they would exit their trenches and attack. The Central Powers would then annihilate the attack. In response, the Central Powers would launch thousands of shots, pouring deadly bombs on the Allied army. And after hours of bombardment, Central Power soldiers would exit their trench and attack, getting mowed down by Allied gunfire. And repeat this over and over and over again. This would go on for days or weeks until a victor could be established. Sometimes millions of men were killed on the battlefield just to gain 100 yards. The area between the trenches had a very dubious name. It was called No Man's Land, because if you were located on this part of the battlefield, you were most likely to be killed. Trench warfare caused a stalemate for many years between the two powers, where each side lost millions of men and gained very little ground. Now, industry during wartime usually brings about new and improved weapons. Most of the time, these weapons made land warfare more dangerous than before. During World War I, there were many weapons that were improved and more deadly. The machine gun was improved by making it much lighter to carry and easier to move around. Flamethrowers were improved and were used heavily by the German armies on the Western Front to force the enemy out of trenches. Artillery and hand grenades were improved and used to kill many people at once. Long guns were improved as anti-aircraft weapons, shooting down enemy planes, with some guns shooting up to 80 miles. Artillery guns and hand grenades definitely inflicted the majority of the casualties in World War I. And finally, barbed wire was used to protect trenches against enemy infiltration. But during World War I, there were new and more deadly weapons introduced and used for the first time. Tanks were introduced in World War I. Armored tanks were used to cross the lands between the trenches or no man's land. They were usually outfitted with cannon and machine guns. In the beginning, they were very hard to steer and became stuck in the mud. However, by the end of the war, tanks became a more effective killing machine. Airplanes were also introduced to the war effort for the first time. Initially, planes were used for surveillance, flying over the trenches and cities of the enemy, gathering important information. Soon after, airplanes would be outfitted with machine guns and bombs, and they would battle each other in the air in what was called dogfights, flying around and attempting to shoot each other down. Later, airplanes would be used to fly over no man's land and trenches, shoot machine gun fire, and drop bombs onto the enemy, making men easy targets and causing many casualties. The final weapon that was introduced during World War I and produced the most horrific casualties out of any new weapon was poison chemical gases. Germany first used chlorine gas to poison unsuspecting Allied troops in the trenches. Later, a more dangerous gas, mustard gas, was produced and used by the Central and Allied powers. These gases were by far the most deadly of the new weapons. They would suffocate you from the inside, destroying your lungs, sometimes filling them with liquid and causing you to drown. Other times the gas would blister and melt your skin off, and by the end of the war, gas masks were introduced to all of the troops, and poison gas became less effective as a weapon. Gas masks were even issued to some animals. So I'm going to go ahead and show you some pictures here, right? Here's some poison gas attacks and what it looked like, right? So you have a couple of men here who have their gas masks, and they have their gas mask for their donkey. This is what it would look like. They would just throw some canisters out there, and the wind would take this gas, and it would spread it throughout the trenches. These poor men right here, they were a victim of poison gases. So you can see here with this little chart here, it looks like 1.3 million, somewhere around there, total poison gas deaths between 1914 and 1918, and they break it down by the country. Here's some men wearing gas masks while firing the new machine gun. Here's a new airplane flying through the air. This is what I was saying, those dog fights. They would have machine guns on them, and they would try to shoot each other down. And here's just a quick chart that I found via the U.S. Department of Justice and PBS and the Wall Street Journal. As you can see here, you have your combatants, Russia, Britain, France, Italy, the United States. Here's all the allied powers. Then you have the central powers right here. This is how many were killed. Now, this numbers down here are by the millions. So 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 million. So it looks like, Russia had definitely the most combatants fighting this war. And look at these numbers, right? So they had almost 2 million killed, upwards around 6+ million wounded, another million and change missing. Or prisoners, and only a few 2 million were remaining to fight the war. And look at this, it's 70%, 76% losses of their share of forces. And these numbers are huge for Russia and Germany and France, Austria, Hungary. People were in the war for a long time. And then you look at the United States down here, where they have a whole lot of remaining combatants left. Only 7.1% losses in this war. So World War I and a lot of the new weapons, you have a lot of new people, new weapons, lots more men dying. All right, guys, we're going to come up to our 4th installment, and I will see you next time.